Paris, March 1976, the world outside the Olympia Theatre. The line stretched 3 blocks down Boulevard des Capucines, winding past shuttered cafes and dimly lit bookshops where Hemingway once browsed for inspiration. 5,000 people stood in the cold March drizzle, their breath visible in the streetlights, waiting for a man who had already decided he might not show up at all. They didn't know it yet, but Lou Reed was 3 kilometers away in a hotel room at Le Bristol, staring at an empty bottle of whiskey and contemplating whether rock and roll was worth the pain anymore. Outside the Olympia, the crowd grew restless. Inside, the tour manager paced backstage, checking his watch every 30 seconds, knowing that somewhere in the Paris night, his artist was either passed out or planning an escape. This wasn't just another concert delay. This was the moment when Lou Reed's self-destruction would collide with his genius, creating a performance that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. The electricity in the venue felt different that night. Veteran concert-goers would later describe it as the kind of tension that precedes either catastrophe or transcendence, though no one could have predicted which. The opening act had finished 90 minutes earlier. The stage sat empty, amplifiers humming their expectant drone, microphone stands positioned like sentries awaiting their commander. But Lou Reed was not coming. Not yet. Because 4 blocks away, he was losing a battle with himself that had been raging since 1959, since the day his parents decided their 17-year-old son needed to be fixed with electroshock therapy. And tonight, in Paris, that old wound had torn open again. If you've stayed with us this far, you're about to hear a story that reveals the real Lou Reed, the one behind the dark sunglasses and leather jacket. This channel brings you the untold moments that shaped rock history. Subscribe now so you don't miss the truth behind the legends. The phone call had come at 4 in the afternoon. Rachel, the woman whose presence had defined Lou Reed's most vulnerable years, whose trans identity had made her both his muse and his mark of defiance against a world that wanted everyone to fit into neat categories. They hadn't spoken in 8 months, not since the night she walked out of his New York apartment with nothing but a suitcase and the conviction that loving Lou Reed was going to kill her. But now her voice crackled through the international line, shaky and small, and she said the words that would unravel him completely. She was sick, really sick. The kind of sick that had timelines and hospital appointments and doctors who spoke in careful, measured tones about preparing for the worst. And she wanted him to know, even though she'd promised herself she wouldn't call, even though her friends had begged her to let him go, to let them both move forward into whatever separate futures awaited them. Lou Reed had hung up the phone without saying goodbye. He'd walked to the minibar, methodically removed every bottle, and begun drinking with the focused intensity of a man trying to drown not just his feelings, but his entire consciousness. The tour manager found him 2 hours later, sprawled across the bed, mumbling lyrics to songs that didn't exist yet, weeping openly in a way that his closest friends had never witnessed. When asked if he could perform that night, Reed had laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that held no humor whatsoever, and said he couldn't perform ever again, that the whole charade of being Lou Reed, rock and roll animal, was exhausting beyond measure. But then he'd sat up, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and said something the tour manager would repeat in interviews decades later. He said okay, he said he'd go, but he warned that what happened on that stage wasn't going to be pretty. The Olympia Theatre in 1976 was more than just a venue. It was a cathedral of French music history, a place where Edith Piaf had sung her heart into fragments, where Jacques Brel had transformed suffering into art, The building itself seemed to absorb the emotions of every performance, its red velvet seats and gilded balconies holding the ghosts of 1,000 vulnerable moments. Lou Reed had played there before, in 1972 during the Transformer tour when David Bowie's production had made him briefly famous beyond the underground cult that had sustained him. That night had been triumphant, professional, controlled. Tonight would be none of those things. As the minutes ticked past the scheduled start time, as 7 o'clock became 7:30 became 8 o'clock, the crowd's mood shifted from excitement to confusion to anger. People began shouting, some demanded refunds, others simply left, disgusted, feeling cheated by a rock star's typical excess and disrespect. But those who stayed, those 5,000 souls who chose to wait in that historic theater, were about to witness something that transcended a typical concert. They were about to see a man break open in public, revealing the raw, undefended core that most artists spend their careers hiding. Because when Lou Reed finally arrived at the Olympia at 8:15, stumbling through the stage door with his sunglasses askew and his leather jacket stained with something that might have been whiskey or might have been tears, he was not the calculated rebel of his public image. He was just Louis Allen Reed, a 54-year-old man from Brooklyn who'd been told his whole life that who he was wasn't acceptable, that his desires were sick, that his art was too dark, too honest, too willing to speak about the parts of human experience that polite society preferred to ignore. The stage manager tried to brief him. There was a running order, a set list carefully crafted to showcase the new album Rock and Roll Heart, while satisfying the old fans who wanted Velvet Underground classics. Reed waved him away, not rudely but with the distracted gesture of someone whose mind was operating in an entirely different dimension. He walked to the stage entrance and stood there, listening to the angry murmur of the crowd, the shouts of people who'd paid good money and felt betrayed. His guitarist approached, asked if he was okay, if he needed anything. Reed turned to him with eyes that looked both completely present and utterly absent, and said he needed everyone to just let him do what he needed to do. No planned set list, no safety net, just him and whatever came out when he opened his mouth. The lights went down. The crowd's anger turned to anticipation. 5,000 people held their breath as a single spotlight illuminated the microphone at center stage. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then Lou Reed walked out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who wasn't entirely sure the ground would hold him. He wore his trademark sunglasses despite the dim lighting, his black t-shirt wrinkled, his jeans torn not fashionably, but genuinely, as if he'd been living in them for days. He reached the microphone, gripped the stand with both hands like a drowning man clutching driftwood, and stood there in silence. The angry shouts began again, louder now, emboldened by his appearance. Someone near the front yelled in French-accented English that they wanted their money back. Someone else shouted that he was a disgrace, a has-been, a junkie who didn't deserve their time. The insults came faster, meaner, and Lou Reed stood there taking them like he deserved every word. Then he spoke. His voice, amplified by the microphone, cut through the chaos with unexpected clarity. The words he said that night were simple, devastating, and completely unplanned. He said, "You're right. I'm a mess. I'm a disaster. I drink too much. I've hurt people I love. I've wasted talent and opportunities and second chances. You're absolutely right about all of it." The crowd went quiet, unsure how to respond to such naked admission. Reed continued, his voice steady now, gaining strength. "But these songs These songs are real. They're about people who don't fit, people who love wrong, people who hurt and bleed and survive anyway. And if you can stay, if you can listen, I promise I'll give you everything I have left. The silence that followed was profound, almost sacred. No one shouted. No one left. Because in that moment, Lou Reed had done something revolutionary. He'd refused to perform invincibility. He'd stood on stage in front of 5,000 strangers and admitted his brokenness. And somehow that admission created a connection more powerful than any rehearsed rock star swagger could have achieved. He turned to his band, nodded once, and they began to play. But before the first chord could resolve, before the drummer could establish his rhythm, Reed stopped them. He held up his hand and said he needed to do this differently. He walked to the edge of the stage, sat down with his legs dangling over the orchestra pit, and asked if someone could bring him an acoustic guitar. The request baffled his band, baffled the sound engineers, but someone scrambled to find the instrument. When it arrived, Reed cradled it awkwardly, his fingers finding the strings with the uncertain touch of someone relearning an old language. He looked out at the audience, though with his dark glasses no one could see where his gaze actually landed, and he said he was going to play them a song. Not one from the set list, not one from any album. A song he'd written 3 years ago and never recorded, never performed, because it was too personal, too revealing, too much of a window into the parts of himself he'd spent his whole career hiding. What he played next would become legend, whispered about in music circles for decades. The song began with 3 simple chords, repeated in a cycle that felt both mournful and defiant. Reed's voice, when it came, was raw and unpolished, stripped of the cool detachment he usually employed. The lyrics told a story about electroshock therapy, about lying on a hospital table while doctors attached electrodes to your temples because your parents thought you were broken, because loving who you loved made you sick in their eyes. He sang about the voltage coursing through his brain, about losing pieces of memory, about waking up and not knowing who you were anymore, except that you were supposed to be different now, fixed, acceptable. The Olympia Theatre, with its history of grand performances and theatrical emotion, had never heard anything quite like this. This wasn't performance. This was confession, exorcism, public therapy conducted in front of thousands. People in the audience began to cry. Not polite, concealed tears, but open, shaking sobs, because Reed was singing about something larger than his own experience. He was singing about every person who'd been told they were wrong, broken, in need of correction. Every gay teenager beaten by their father. Every trans woman rejected by her family. Every artist told their vision was too dark, too strange, too unacceptable for mainstream consumption. The song built in intensity, Reed's voice cracking on certain words, his guitar playing becoming more aggressive, more chaotic. When he reached the final verse, he was nearly shouting, the raw emotion overwhelming any technical precision. And when the last chord faded into silence, no one moved. No one applauded. The collective shock was too complete. Reed sat there for a long moment, breathing heavily, his shoulders shaking. Then he stood up, handed the guitar back to a stagehand, and walked to his band. He turned to face the audience again, and this time when he spoke, his voice was different, stronger, clearer. He said, "Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying," and now he was going to play them some rock and roll. The band launched into a blistering version of White Light, White Heat, and suddenly the entire energy shifted. This was Lou Reed, the rock god, the guitar-slinging provocateur, the man who'd written songs about heroin and hustlers and everything polite society wanted to forget. But now, after what they just witnessed, the audience understood that the swagger was armor, that behind every cool pose was a person fighting desperately to survive. The next 90 minutes were extraordinary. Reed played with abandon, mixing deep cuts from the Velvet Underground catalog with tracks from his solo albums. He told stories between songs, rambling narratives about Andy Warhol's factory, about transgender friends who disappeared into the New York night, about the time David Bowie called him at 3 a.m. to tell him the Transformer album was going to change both their lives. Some stories were funny, others heartbreaking, all of them revealing. The audience was no longer a collection of consumers waiting for entertainment. They were witnesses to something rare and precious, a complete artistic unraveling and reconstruction happening in real time. But the defining moment was still to come. Near the end of the concert, Reed announced he was going to play Perfect Day. The song from his 1972 Transformer album had become one of his most beloved tracks, a seemingly simple love song that carried undertones of melancholy and loss. He'd written it about Rachel, about a rare afternoon when the chaos of their lives had paused long enough for them to simply exist together without drama or drugs or the weight of the world's judgment. But tonight, after the phone call, after learning about her illness, the song carried different weight. Reed sat at the piano, something he rarely did in concert, and began the opening chords. His voice, when he sang the first line about it being such a perfect day, cracked immediately. He stopped, apologized to the audience, started again. This time he made it through the first verse before emotion overwhelmed him. He sat at the piano, head bowed, and the audience understood they were watching a man grieve in public. After a moment, he looked up and spoke directly to them. He said this song was about someone who saved his life, who saw him at his worst and loved him anyway, who taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness. He said he'd just learned she was dying, and he didn't know how to process that. Didn't know how to exist in a world where she wasn't somewhere out there, living her life, being magnificent. The confession hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Then Reed tried again. This time, he made it through the entire song, his voice trembling but steady, every word weighted with the knowledge that he was singing to someone who might not have many perfect days left. When the last note faded, the standing ovation was instantaneous and thunderous. 5,000 people rose to their feet, applauding not just the performance, but the courage it took to be that naked, that honest. Reed stood from the piano, walked to the front of the stage, and did something completely out of character. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, scanned the crowd. He smiled, a small, genuine expression that transformed his usually guarded face. He thanked them again, said they'd given him something tonight, though he couldn't quite articulate what. Then he walked off stage, leaving his band to improvise an extended outro of feedback and noise while he disappeared into the wings. Backstage, Reed collapsed into a chair and sat in silence for 20 minutes, while his tour manager fielded questions from venue staff and band members. When he finally spoke, he asked for a phone. He needed to call someone, he said. Needed to tell Rachel that he'd sung for her tonight, that 5,000 strangers in Paris had witnessed his love for her. And maybe that counted for something. Maybe that meant something in the grand accounting of a messy, complicated, beautiful life. The call connected, rang 6 times, went to an answering machine. Reed left a message, his voice hoarse from singing and emotion, telling her about the concert, about the song, about how sorry he was for all the ways he'd failed her. He said he loved her, said he'd always loved her, said he hoped she knew that, had always known that, despite everything. The aftermath of that Paris concert rippled through Reed's career in unexpected ways. Critics who'd written him off as a fading provocateur reassessed their positions. The performance became legendary, whispered about in music circles, though no official recording existed. Bootlegs circulated, the audio quality terrible, capturing only fragments of what had transpired. But those who'd been there, those 5,000 witnesses, they carried the memory like a secret. A reminder that beneath the constructed personas of rock stardom lived actual human beings with actual pain. Reed himself rarely spoke about that night in interviews. When pressed, he'd deflect, make a joke, change the subject. But his friends noticed a shift. He drank less, not sober, but less reckless. He began writing songs that didn't hide behind metaphor and cool detachment. His 1978 album Street Hassle would contain some of his most emotionally direct work, influenced by that Paris night and what he'd learned about the power of vulnerability. Rachel survived another 3 years. They reconciled briefly, tentatively, creating a friendship from the ruins of their romance. Reed would later say that those final years of knowing her, of being able to call her and talk about music and art and the absurdity of existence, meant more to him than any commercial success. When she finally passed in 1979, Reed didn't perform for 3 months. He retreated into writing, producing the songs that would eventually become The Blue Mask, an album widely regarded as his masterpiece of personal excavation. Critics noted the change in his work, the willingness to engage with pain directly rather than coating it in ironic distance. What they didn't know was that the transformation had begun years earlier, on a March night in Paris, when he'd chosen honesty over armor. The Olympia Theatre concert became a touchstone for a generation of artists who'd grown up believing that coolness and detachment were prerequisites for rock credibility. Lou Reed had proven something different. He'd shown that breaking down could be as powerful as building up, that admitting weakness could create connections stronger than any display of strength. Musicians as diverse as Patti Smith, Kurt Cobain, and Jeff Buckley would later cite that concert, or the stories about it, as influential to their own approach to performance. The idea that a rock show could be therapeutic, could be a space for genuine human vulnerability, traced back to that rainy Parisian night when a drunk, grieving man chose truth over polish. Years later, in 1996, Lou Reed would perform at the Olympia again. This time he was sober, married to performance artist Laurie Anderson, and approaching something resembling peace with his complicated history. Before the encore, he told the audience a story about the last time he'd played there, about how he'd almost not shown up, about how they'd saved him by choosing to stay and listen. He didn't go into details, didn't need to. Some people in the crowd remembered. They'd been 20 years younger, standing in that same space, witnessing that same broken man find a way through. Now they were older, carrying their own accumulated scars and compromises, and they understood even more deeply what Reed had offered them back then. The gift of seeing someone survive their own worst moment and come out the other side still making art, still fighting, still here. The legacy of that night extends beyond music history into something more fundamental about the relationship between artist and audience. When Lou Reed died in 2013, the obituaries focused on his commercial successes, his Velvet Underground innovations, his influence on punk and alternative rock. But in the comment sections of music blogs, in the remembrances shared by aging fans, the Paris concert kept appearing. People who'd been there wrote about it as a life-changing experience, a moment when they realized that art could be more than entertainment, that performances could be acts of genuine communion between performer and witness. The specifics of what Reed had said, what he'd sung, had blurred with time, but the emotional truth remained crystalline. They'd watched someone choose vulnerability in a medium that typically demands invincibility, and it had changed how they understood both music and their own capacity for honest self-expression. The unrecorded song Reed had played that night, the one about electroshock therapy, was never released officially. No studio recording exists, but musicians who'd been in the audience attempted to recreate it from memory, posting their versions online decades later. Each interpretation varied slightly, proof that memory is unreliable, subjective, influenced by what we need a moment to mean. But all the versions shared certain elements: the simple chord progression, the brutal honesty of the lyrics, the sense of someone exorcising demons in real time. In a way, the song's non-existence in official form makes it more powerful, more mythic. It exists only in collective memory, in stories told by those who were there, becoming more legendary with each retelling. Lou Reed's journey from that Paris stage to his final years contained many chapters of growth, relapse, recovery, and artistic reinvention. He would struggle with sobriety, succeed, fail, try again. He would make brilliant albums and forgettable ones. He would marry Laurie Anderson and find a partnership that allowed him to age with grace and continued creativity. But that March night in 1976 remained a pivot point, a moment when he discovered that the armor he'd built to protect himself from a cruel world was also preventing real connection with the people who loved his work. By choosing to remove that armor, even briefly, even messily, he'd created something more valuable than any carefully rehearsed performance could achieve. The lesson of that Paris concert wasn't that artists should perform drunk or unprepared. It wasn't an endorsement of chaos or self-destruction. Rather, it was a reminder that authenticity, however uncomfortable, creates bonds that transcendence and technique alone cannot forge. The 5,000 people who'd waited through that delay, who'd chosen to stay despite their anger, who'd witnessed Lou Reed's breakdown and breakthrough, they'd participated in something rare. They'd been trusted with someone's real self, not the constructed persona, but the actual struggling human underneath. And they'd responded not with judgment, but with empathy, creating a space where vulnerability could exist without punishment. In the decades since, as concert culture has become increasingly professionalized and controlled, the idea of a major artist appearing on stage drunk and emotionally destroyed seems almost quaint, or irresponsible, or both. Modern tour production minimizes risk, ensures consistency, protects the artist's brand. But something is lost in that protection: the possibility of genuine surprise, of witnessing a moment that could never be replicated, of connecting with an artist's true self, rather than their marketed image. The Paris concert represented a time when such moments were still possible, when the gap between performer and audience could close completely, if only for one night. Lou Reed never claimed to have learned any grand lessons from that experience. When asked about it in later years, he'd typically shrug and say he'd been fucked up, had barely remembered the show, wasn't proud of keeping people waiting. But those who knew him well recognized this deflection as vintage Reed, the man who'd spent his entire career avoiding earnest declaration. What he did instead was write songs. Songs that became progressively more honest, more willing to examine his own failures and fears. songs that acknowledged pain without either glorifying or dismissing it. Songs that suggested survival was possible, even for people as damaged as he'd been. The work spoke what the man wouldn't say directly. The final irony is that the concert which almost didn't happen, which began with an angry crowd and a paralytically drunk performer, became one of the most significant of Lou Reed's career. Not because of musical virtuosity or perfect execution, but because of its absolute imperfection, its willingness to be a mess, a document of one human being's attempt to remain functional despite overwhelming grief and chemical dependency. In a catalog filled with iconic performances, the Paris show stood apart not for its polish, but for its rawness, its refusal to pretend that everything was okay when nothing was okay. Those who search for recordings of that night will be disappointed. What exists is fragments, partial bootlegs with abysmal sound quality that capture only pieces of what transpired. Perhaps that's appropriate. Some moments resist documentation, existing only in the memories of those present, becoming more meaningful through their very ephemerality. The Paris concert belongs to the 5,000 witnesses, to the stories they've told their children and grandchildren, to the mythology of rock and roll as something more than entertainment, something occasionally approaching shared catharsis. Lou Reed walked off that Olympia stage in March 1976 as a man who'd survived exposing himself completely. He'd expected judgment, mockery, perhaps even to be pelted with garbage. Instead, he'd received something more unsettling: compassion, understanding, love even, from strangers who recognized their own struggles in his public breakdown. That recognition changed him, not dramatically or immediately, but gradually, like water reshaping stone. The armor went back on eventually. He was still Lou Reed, still capable of being difficult, arrogant, deliberately provocative. But underneath, something had shifted. He'd learned that showing weakness didn't destroy him, that vulnerability could be survived. And in learning that, he'd created art that would outlive him, resonating with everyone who'd ever felt too broken to be loved, too honest to be accepted, too real for a world that preferred its pain prettily packaged and easily digested. The story of that night is ultimately a story about second chances, about how the moments we think will destroy us might instead become the foundations for rebuilding something stronger, about how the worst versions of ourselves sometimes create the most genuine connections, about how being seen, truly seen, in our complete disastrous humanity can be both terrifying and liberating. Lou Reed understood this instinctively, even when he couldn't articulate it, even when he was too drunk to stand straight. He understood that rock and roll, at its best, was never about perfection. It was about honesty. And on that rainy night in Paris, he'd been as honest as any artist has ever dared to be.